Be honest, does your FlutterFlow app only have one database? No, I get it, it's tempting. You start your FlutterFlow project, you've set up Supabase, you've set up Firebase, Stripe, OpenAI, notifications, so close to launching that dream app and making that sweet, sweet cash money. And you knew that you were supposedly meant to have environments, something about dev and prod. You'll get it done just before launching, and then it kind of doesn't happen. People still debate about whether FlutterFlow apps are scalable, but you know what isn't scalable? Developing new features on top of production data. So in this video, we're going to talk about Supabase and the databases that you need to spin up to get your app stable with isolated environments, so that a rogue SQL command isn't all it would take to nuke your whole business. So let's get started. You need to separate your production data from your development data. That's software engineering 101, and if you don't do it, then sooner or later you'll corrupt your users' data. It can take a little while to get used to this workflow, but this isn't the kind of nice to have, let's do it when we can kind of task. It's a big boy pants task. But this is far from complicated. You just go to Supabase and create an extra database. Let's say I have a production database called Palmas. I could create another database in Supabase, and then I would call it Palmas Dev. You'll do this in Firebase too. If you have a project called Palmas, then you create another Firebase project and call it Palmas Dev. Then head to the FlutterFlow console and peg these environments in the Dev Environments feature. Use environment variables to set the Supabase credentials. Fantastic! Now you've got two databases, and you can use the dev one to mess around and develop your app in a way that's totally isolated from what your users are doing in production. Thing is, you need to keep the schemas in sync. What if you were to add new columns, new ORLS policies, new tables to your database in dev? They're not going to magically appear in production, and it would take forever to copy everything over by hand, and you're guaranteed to make a mistake anyway. Here's where things get interesting. You can actually run Supabase on your laptop. You'll need to install two tools for this. The first one is Docker, and the other one is the Supabase CLI, or command line interface. To get the details of the commands and the step-by-step instructions for all of this, just visit the free article that I've written. The link is in the description. Okay, so I've got the Supabase CLI installed, and I'll log in to authenticate with Supabase. Then I run Supabase init. If you already have some project files, like in my case, I have some Python files that also deploy in support of my FlutterFlow project, you can bundle all of this together. Now, Supabase init will create a Supabase folder in the project. The next command to run is Supabase start. This command will use your Docker install to download the whole suite of Supabase and get it running locally. It's basically magic. When it's done, it'll spit out some credentials. This one, for instance, is the studio, and so I can visit this URL and I'll have the whole Supabase dashboard running locally. By the way, 127.0.0.1 is the IP address of your local machine, and so this is totally isolated and it'll work even without internet. So I can go ahead and visit this studio, and I can mess around. I can go into the table editor, I can create tables, do ORLS, whatever I want. And then I can just burn the whole thing. For that, I'll use Supabase DB reset. Do you get the idea? It's a sandbox. You can do whatever you want. You can test out ideas, experiment, add data, and then you can just start over at any time. And your data in the cloud is completely untouched, and this local data is totally expendable. Now we're going to start syncing what we have in the cloud with what we have locally. That way, instead of starting from zero every time, you'll start from a snapshot of what you have in production. First, we'll link what's happening locally to what's in the cloud so that information can flow downward. Use Supabase link for this and choose the project. You'll need your database password as well. Next, Supabase pull will pull down your schema from prod and add that initial blueprint of your production data to a folder here in a file called a migration. The version in the cloud will also need to stay synced, so choose yes for updating the migration history table. A migration is like a map to get a fresh database into a particular state. That can happen in one migration file or several. So before any migrations are applied, I would have a totally clean slate in my Supabase database locally. But if I then go to the client and I apply Supabase DB reset, what it's going to do is it's going to clean out the database, but then it's going to come back up with the new migrations that are found in the migrations directory. And so now when that's done, I get the schema from my production database into my local database. But it's not exactly the same because where's my data? The data itself between environments is different. That's the whole point of all of this. So the data isn't fixed in the same way that the schema is. Instead, if we want data, it kind of doesn't matter what the data is. If we just want whatever data, so we have something to play with, we call that seed data. What I can do is dump whatever data is in the prod database into a local file. For that, I use Supabase DB dump and I specify the file with the data only flag. Note that this won't work if your prod database is gigantic. In that case, you'll need to only dump a subset of the database. So now I've created this seed.sql file, and Supabase DB reset knows this naming convention and it will apply the seed automatically when I reset the database. Another thing that you can also do is to run the same thing for roles and create a roles.sql file. And roles.sql is another naming convention that the Supabase client will pick up on and apply automatically, along with the seed data and the migrations. So now note that our database, nothing's actually happened. We've just been dumping data into files, but not into the database itself. However, when I go ahead and do the reset, it's going to apply all of the roles and the seed data and the migrations. And so now in my database, I can see that I actually have the data. And bear in mind, if I mess with this, for example, if I just go ahead and delete this post table entirely, I can still just go back here, reset the database again, and it will return. So reset really is resetting the whole database and then building it again from seed. So I'll just do a refresh, and there's my post table again with all of the data in it. Okay, so now you have a local database. You can test things out, experiment, and start over when you want to with zero risk of tampering with your production database. So what now? None of this is much good if you can't apply the new changes to the cloud whenever they're ready. We're already synced up to the production database because we pulled down what was there and created these migration files. But we also need to sync our dev database as well so we can test out any new schema changes in our FlutterFlow project. So now we'll unlink the local instance from prod and then instead link to dev. Now we're linked to a fresh database in the cloud with no migrations applied to it. Supabase DB push will try to apply the migrations we have locally to the cloud instance. Sweet, so now we're in the dev database for this project, and I've just pushed the changes. So all I need to do is refresh, and then there are my tables. At some point, you'll want to update the schema. Let's say I want to add a table called items to my database. First, I do this locally. If I make any mistakes, I can reset the database at any time I want, but when I'm happy with the new schema change, in this case adding the table items, I'll want to create a migration file. For this, I'll use the diff command and pipe the new changes to a migration file called create items table. This will compare the schema that I had previously in my local database, and it'll create the migration based on what's different now since the changes that I made in the dashboard. So now, even though I created the items table in the dashboard in my local Supabase instance, Supabase was able to translate this into a SQL file. And now it's part of the migrations history, and it can be applied to the dev and also the prod databases at will. And we can go ahead and do that. All I need to do is another Supabase DB push, and then my new table, which I created locally, will actually be available in my dev instance. And there it is, items. Great, now I have my new table in my dev database. I can go to FlutterFlow and I can develop my new feature. And you can add migrations as often as you want, but the important thing to remember is that now you have a source of truth for your migrations and schema in this Supabase folder. So don't make changes to schemas in the dashboard anymore in the cloud. If you do, it's fixable, but it'll cause you headaches when the schema changes are coming from all random directions. Make the changes locally, push them to dev, and then test. And then finally, when you've developed your new feature and you're ready to deploy to production, now you can make the schema change in production. Unlink from dev, link to prod, and then push your changes. Always do this with care and thoroughly test your changes afterwards. And if you want to take this to the next level, it's also possible to set these things up in a CI/CD workflow using something like GitHub Actions. And the Supabase documentation will take you through how you can do this when you're ready to take it to the next level. Using this Supabase workflow will allow you to do your development work with no worries that your users might be affected by anything you do while you're developing your FlutterFlow app. Let me know in the comments if you're using this pattern or a different pattern to manage your Supabase environments. And if you're interested in learning more about how to work with databases for your FlutterFlow project, try this video next.